So this morning as a church family we have come to be together with God. And I know His presence is here. I'm certainly glad to be here with you to meet God. So before we open the Word, let's bow our heads in prayer. Father, this morning we have come to spend time with you in worship because you are worthy. And as you speak to us through your word, I pray that we will be inspired, our ears will be open, and will be obedient. So bless these lips that they will be anointed from heaven is my prayer. Amen. I want you to think this morning of the worst thing that anybody could do to your family or to our church. The worst thing possible. Just let your imagination go. What would it be that would cause you to feel so much pain, anger, and anguish? I can think of one or two things that as they go through my mind now, it's causing me anguish that could happen. Then I want you to imagine that some years later, the person who caused so much angst, so much anguish, came to you and asked you to forgive them. Can you imagine that? How would you react? Could you do it? Could you actually forgive that person with a genuine... Let me tell you about this lady. We'll put a picture up on the screen. Her name is Corrie ten Boom. Now, some of you may have heard of this lady. Her family was Dutch, and they were Christians, devout Christians, believers. And during the Second World War, she and her family were sent to concentration camp because they helped Jews and some other people who were threatened by the Nazis. They hid them and helped them to escape. They thought that that was their Christian duty. Well, they were caught and they were sent to concentration camp. Now, I looked this on the internet at the concentration camp that they were sent to, and it was a horrendous place. It was terrible. They were put through the worst torture possible. Corrie's parents were killed. I think one of her brothers was killed. And eventually her sister, who was so close to Corrie, died in front of her eyes there in that concentration camp. Can you imagine what went through Corrie's mind? What she struggled with the many thousands of others who were in that place. Well, somehow Corrie survived, and she was finally released. But her story of survival itself is such a miracle that she was asked to talk at many Christian gatherings. And if you want to read her amazing story, get hold of the book, The Hiding Place. In fact, it's a movie, The Hiding Place. A wonderful book. Well, one evening after she had given a talk, she was standing at the front door of the church shaking hands. And a man with a strong German accent shook her hand and said he was moved by her presentation. But he mentioned that he had a greater need, however, in coming to that meeting. And it was the greater need that brought him to speak to her. You see, he was one of the guards in the concentration camp that had tortured Corrie and her sister and her parents. He was one of the guards. And he'd become a Christian. After the war, he'd given his life to Jesus, and he felt that he needed to seek forgiveness from those that he had wronged. The shock and the panic and the emotion in Corrie ten Boom as this man put out his hand to her. She describes that she froze. Well, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? The memories of what this man and the others had done over those years. There was a moment, she described, where the hatred just welled up within her. But then, just as quickly, she realized that this man needed to be healed of his guilt. That's why he had come. She remembered that Jesus had died for him and that heaven's forgiveness could be his as well as anybody else's. The thought flooded through her mind and overtook her. And instead of being overwhelmed by hatred, Corrie ten Boom hugged this former Nazi guard and gave him her forgiveness. Wonderful story. Now, let me ask you, how would you have reacted if you were Corrie ten Boom? Think about it. How would you have reacted? But on the other hand, how would you have felt if you were the former guard and you desperately needed forgiveness? How would you have felt? Coming to that church that day, seeking forgiveness. How would you have felt? You know, one of the most powerful things about the Christian message is the guarantee that no one is too far gone into sin that we can't be rescued, forgiven and healed. That's the amazing story of the gospel. None of us are too far gone that God couldn't reach out and hug us and forgive us. You see, the heart of the gospel is that no matter how guilty I feel I am, no matter what I might have done in my life, Christ's death gives me the confidence of knowing that I can be forgiven, healed, and restored into His image. What an amazing story of the gospel. The gospel is so simple and uncomplicated. Let me remind you again from John 3 just how simple and uncomplicated God made our salvation. You know John 3 really well. And we're going to put it up on the screen, but I want you this morning to read it with me. Just read it together and remind yourself of how uncomplicated it is. So here it is, John 3, 16, 17 and 18. And if you can read the screen, let's read that translation together. You ready? Let's go. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through Him. Whoever believes in Him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the one only Son of God. Wow. Let's just check out verse 18 again. Have a look at it. Have a look at what it's really saying. What it's saying is the offer is there. The forgiveness offer is there. But it's our lack of belief or faith that stops us from receiving the forgiveness. That's what verse 18 says. It's totally our fault if we don't receive it. Not God's fault. He's done everything possible. It's up to us to accept it. Surely, and this is the part where we find it so difficult. There's an argument that happens within us, and it goes something like this. Surely God can't include me in all of this. I'm too far gone. I'm too sinful. There's stuff that is so rotten within me. Anyway, when I face the judgment, He's going to bring up all of the junk from my past. It's going to be there for the universe to see. I've had it. Have you ever thought that? Have those words ever crossed your mind? Well, let me tell you, the story of the gospel paints another picture. Those thoughts that just went through your mind, the negative thoughts, were a lie that was implanted by Satan himself. They are a lie. The gospel paints another picture. You see, the gospel is full of grace. It's full of love. And it's full of God's patience towards us. If you want to look at that, remember the story in our lesson this week, the story of Jonah. God is anxious to forgive us. And when He forgives, the amazing thing is that He forgets. It's gone. He doesn't remember it. The desperate cry for forgiveness by us is meant by an instant yes by God Himself. I'm going to speak to you personally. If you're struggling this morning with a heart that doubts, struggling to accept the forgiveness, the grace of God, if this morning your life is full of guilt and the regrets of what's happened, if you are wondering if God could ever forgive you for what you have done in the past, or maybe what you are presently doing and living in your life, bring it to God. Hand it over and accept it just like that. Here's your opportunity right now to accept the good news at this very moment that you can also receive His forgiveness and His mercy right now where you are. What a God. What a story. What grace. I'm going to speak to the young people. The few that are here at the moment. Let me tell you, these are the times of your life when you will experiment with stuff that later on you would wish you had never gone down that road. I can tell you from my personal experience that sometimes what you experiment with now leaves a permanent mark in your heart, in your mind. The things that burn within me were the stuff that I got into when I was young. And I've struggled with God's forgiveness. I'm so thankful He does. He has forgiven me. I can let it go. So be wise in your choices, young people. Listen to the Spirit speaking. Let me tell you about the function of church in the process of forgiveness, the process of healing for those who are broken. The church is meant to be a place where people experience God's grace and forgiveness. That's our function. It's meant to be a place where broken people are not judged at all. Church is meant to be a place where people are loved and accepted and they experience God's healing in their lives. Because this place is a hospital for sinners, not a judgment court for criminals. Every one of us have come into this place broken and needing God's forgiveness and healing. Every one of us. We're all part of the grace process that God offers. Every one of us. We're all in stages of healing. And just as God's grace forgives and accepts us, so our grace and love forgives and accepts anyone who is searching for it as well. You remember about that former guard? The Nazi guard, remember him? Who was desperately searching for grace and forgiveness? Can you imagine what would have happened if Corrie ten Boom had hung on to her bitterness, her criticism and her anger and not forgiven him? Can you imagine what would have happened to him that day? If our church is to be a place of healing for all people, what a great motto that would be, by the way. This is a place of healing for all people. If it is, then we need to correct the message we send out about God's forgiveness. How we act sends a message about God. You see, so often we have passed judgment on people, and in the end they leave because of discouragement. The shame is that we continually remember their sinful past and keep reminding them. And as a result, they get the idea that God also remembers their past and He will not forgive them. That's the thinking process for them. How do I know this is true? Because I have met many young people, even in this district, who left church because they felt they were judged. I just pray somehow that we can reclaim them with a different message again. There's a story recorded in John 8. A powerful story, which, by the way, was not written in the original scriptures. It was added sometime later on by an editor. But this story in John 8 addresses the issue of forgiveness. Now, you know the story so well. It's the story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. And she was dragged before Jesus for judgment, for condemnation. I'd love us to read it again because the message is so powerful. And as Natasha reads the story this morning, I want you to transport your thinking, just transport yourself into the story as if you were actually there, watching, being part of the story. And I want you to ask yourself, who do you relate to in the story? Which character could you imagine being you? Let's hear the story again.
I'm reading from the New Living Translation, and it says, "As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. 'Teacher,' they said to Jesus, 'this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?' They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, 'All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone.' They stooped down. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, 'Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?' 'No, Lord,' she said. And Jesus said, 'Neither do I. Go and sin no more.'"
Wow. You can understand why they added the story later on. So powerful. in your mind, I want you to visualize this woman. You see, this is not a random act of adultery. We know this because Jesus commanded her, go and leave your life of sin, tells us she was either a prostitute or she was having an ongoing affair. So she was caught in a lifestyle situation. And so she was dragged by the Jewish leaders in for judgment, knowing that she knows that she's already dead because of her guilt. She's gone. So let's review this woman's situation, her position in life. Whatever the specifics of her sin, she is guilty. And she's placed at the bottom rung of the social scale. She's way down there with the worst of them. And her self-esteem, you can imagine, is terrible. The sad thing is the Pharisees didn't care about her at all. They didn't care one bit. You see, for them, she was just trash. She was something to be used to trap Jesus and then discarded. They didn't care whatsoever what happened to her. No, it's often like that for all of us. Someone who has lived a life being abused. Someone who is trapped in sin and they just can't seem to snap out of it, has a very low feeling about themselves. Maybe you have been in that position. Maybe you're still there. And today you have come to church feeling low. As far as the Jews were concerned, this woman was lost to God's kingdom. She was nothing. She was not up to God's standards and certainly not theirs. In fact, they even associated with her. If they were even to talk with her or touch her, they were unclean. That's what they thought of her. This is where the gospel steps in. This is where God reaches beyond human reasoning and judgment. And it certainly cuts through our own feelings of guilt and worthlessness. And I want to tell you this morning that if that's you, Jesus wants to cut right through that and give you hope and give you a new meaning to your life. You know, remember Jesus spoke to Zacchaeus? Do you remember that time that he spent time with him? This little guy who certainly was on the lowest of the scale of society. And he was considered trash too. But Jesus encouraged Zacchaeus by saying that the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost. That was his purpose. So here's the challenge for us if we claim to be followers of Jesus. Here's our challenge this morning. We need to look at everyone in our society through the eyes of Jesus. We need to look at people through his eyes. Even those that society thinks are trash. We need to view them as Jesus looks at them. You see, Christ's healing salvation is especially for the wounded, especially for the ones who are damaged. It's for the ones who know they need to be healed from their sinfulness. That's where the gospel has the impact. And it's on this point we should remember one thing very clearly. None of us has escaped the scars of sin. Every single one of us. We are all in the hospital of Jesus. And we are all in the process of being healed from the wounds of our own sinful life. Every one of us. And I can tell you quite frankly, the healing is going to keep happening until Jesus comes. So, when anyone who is broken and who looks for healing walks through the front doors of this church, through the front doors of this hospital, we should rejoice and welcome them with open arms. We should be saying, welcome to the emergency department. This is where the physician does his work, and we are part of the process. We need to remember that none of us are any more superior than anybody else. The danger is when we feel we are, when there's a smugness, a disassociation from those who are struggling. None of us has the right to judge people as being a bigger sinner than we are. Not one of us. In fact, Jesus challenged this by saying that a judgmental or critical attitude is one of the most serious of all sins. Because when you're judgmental or critical, you've already blocked the fruits of the Holy Spirit from coming into your own life. That's the reality. The love, the joy, the patience, the peace, the long-suffering, it can't get through whatever we have judgmentalism blocking it. That's the case. If that is the case, then you are choosing to stop the Spirit from filling you with God's character of love, grace, tolerance, and patience. We've already spoken to our young people this morning. That's the trouble. We speak to them or at them. I want to tell you something. Whenever a young person puts their foot tenderly into the front door of this church, gingerly, after many years of night clubbing and loose living, we ought to be showing them love and grace. Whenever an alcoholic sits in a pew to find spiritual rest, we should sit beside that person and welcome him to a safe place of support. Whenever a middle-aged lady comes among us wounded after having had numerous partners, we should show her genuine love instead of passing judgment and further shunning her. That's what we should be doing. How many people in our community are still broken because we cannot forget the past? How many people have left church because they see a judgmental and critical attitude among us? Especially by those who parade themselves as being holy. Now, I don't know the past of this church intimately. You do. Many of you do. You know how we have treated people in the past, what's happened. I do know one thing. The culture of this church at the moment is a loving culture. It's a place of grace and love. Sure, the Spirit's got a lot more work to do yet. But isn't it wonderful to see the fruits working among us? Let's make sure that we practice together, putting the fruits into action, letting the Spirit work among us. You know, just before Jesus left, he gave this command to all Christians. This was his command. This is my command, love each other in the same way that I have loved you. And what does love look like? Can you see the evidence? What does it look like? Well, I can tell you. It's by the way we treat each other. That's what love looks like. You know, 1 Corinthians 13 gives a really excellent picture of what we should be experiencing with each other and how we should be forgiving each other. Have a look at this. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 4 and onwards. Love is patient. and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up. It never loses faith. It's always hopeful and endures through every circumstance. Wow. Imagine what our church would look like if we really adopted and practiced these principles. Can you imagine what would happen if the Spirit moved among us and we just loved to the fullest? Can you imagine what would have happened that day when the woman was caught in adultery? Can you imagine if the church leaders had practiced grace, love and tolerance towards her? Can you imagine? I can tell you that the story would not have been recorded in Scripture because it wouldn't have happened. Today I want to leave you with a challenge. I want you to think this morning about what might be in your heart. What might be deeply bedded within you. Be honest. Is there hurt that you are experiencing that needs to be released? Do you need to forgive someone? Maybe you need to seek forgiveness yourself. Do you find that you are quick to judge people because they display the rawness of their sinful life? Have a think about any historical issues that might have caused friction among us that have been pushed down, but they're still in the subsurface somewhere. Think about it. Think about people that might have left church because of hurt. You know what I reckon? I reckon it's time we adopted the same love, the same compassion, and the same forgiveness that Jesus showed while he was here on this earth. If we are true disciples of his, we have got to adopt the same attitude as him. And I reckon it's time we shone with the character of God and brought healing among ourselves and anybody else who needs it. The challenge is this. This is my prayer. May God help us to be forgiving and gracious as together we lead people to the great healer himself, Jesus Christ. And Spirit himself implant that on your thinking this morning. God bless you this week.